Okay, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Good evening to those of you online as well. I'm Professor Paul Monks, Chief Scientific Advisor at the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, and I'm going to do my pale imitation of David Willits this evening, who unfortunately can't be with us. I have slightly more hair than he does, but that is about the only difference, I think. So thank you very much for joining us. This event is being hosted by the Foundation for Science and Technology. Welcome to those of you joining us in the Royal Society this evening, and welcome to those of you joining us online. The title for today's event is Decarbonising the Built Environment and Delivering the Warm Homes Plan, the Role of Social Science and Engineering. We're very grateful to the Royal Commission for the exhibition of 1851 for supporting this event. Moving towards net zero is a massive multi-year, multi-sector challenge, and huge efforts have been made and a lot of progress has been made so far. I can attest to this fact because it is my daily lived experience about the size of the challenge, but also how far we have come. One of the more challenging areas, absolutely, is decarbonising the built environment. Partly this is because buildings have a long lifespan. The large majority of buildings that will exist in 2050, our net zero target date, have already been constructed. So we have a massive retrofit agenda as well as a need for new buildings. And I was given some statistics by the department, actually, about our stock. The UK has some of the Western Europe's oldest and leakiest housing stock, with approximately 15.5 million homes, that's 52%, rated at EPC D and below, and that comes from the English Housing Survey. In England, around 79% of homes were built pre-1990, and of those, over 61% are rated EPC D or below. And for those of you not familiar with EPC, it's the how energy efficient your house is. A, good, D, not so good, around that. This number rises to almost 80% among the 5.1 million English homes that were built before 1919. So I think that just gives you a flavour, I think, for the scale of the challenge. I think the other thing we hope to bring out in this discourse this evening is it's easy to kind of think about the fabric and what we could do to retrofit it, but it's worth putting at the centre of this is that people live in houses, and people are a really important part of this. So really understanding what social and behavioural sciences can do to help us drive that take-up of retrofit is, in my mind, at least as important as the technologies. All this work needs to be done by people, and there are reasonable questions about the numbers of skilled people we have to deliver this huge challenge. On the policy side, the government has recently released its Warm Homes Plan and is committed to reducing fuel poverty and ensure that no one is left behind during the energy transition. So it's a great time, I think, to have a conversation about this. What we're going to do is the usual sort of format. We're going to have initial comments from 4 speakers, the first of whom I'll introduce in a minute. Then we'll move to a Q&A, and that Q&A, you'll be able to put your questions either in the room or online on Slido, and you can see the number there for the meeting, which is 320-2846. That's not very memorable, is it? But you go there. So you can do that anytime, so there's no reason to wait until the end. There's no need to wait till the Q&A to start. Okay, so without any further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Professor Jennifer Schooling. Jennifer Schooling is a Professor of Digital Innovation and Smart Places at Anglia Ruskin University. She is the co-director of the DARE Research Hub for Decarbonised, Adaptable, Climate-Resilient Transport for a Sustainable Future. She also carries out research on decarbonisation of construction through data. Jennifer was previously the director of the Cambridge Centre for Smart Infrastructure and Construction. She's a chartered engineer and a fellow of the Institution of Civil Engineers. Thank you very much. Jennifer.
Thank you, Paul, and good evening, everyone. So, you may hear again some of what Paul has just said, I'm afraid, because we did not compare notes beforehand, but that's fine. I'm a big fan of tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you've told them. So you've told them what we're going to tell them. It's all good. So this mission that the government has to deliver warm, energy-efficient homes is a real large-scale challenge. And it's, above all, not simply a matter of the technical solutions that are required or even the money that's required to do it. It's also a socio-technical challenge. And I was Googling for an image this morning, so I have borrowed this, this image, that tries to describe socio-technical systems. And what you'll see is that the technology is only one of many components on here. And that actually most of the components on here involve people. So it's about society, it's about individual people, it's about organisations, it's about how people behave, it's about the workplace. And we really have to recognise that if we're trying to do something on such a large scale, that it is a socio-technical problem that involves people at the centre of it. And those people include householders, homeowners, the retrofit supply chain, the product manufacturers, local authorities have a key role to play. So it's a real mixture of different kinds of people. And depending on whether, most of us are at least householders, many of us are homeowners, but we also have official professional hats that we wear as well. So our answers to some of these issues might be different depending on whether we're being, Jennifer Schooling, Professor of Things, or Jennifer Schooling who lives in a 1930s semi. And I'm just going to come back to some of the points that Paul was making about the complexity of our housing stock. So I was giving a talk, just a quick aside, I was giving a talk the other day to a bunch of postdocs and PhD students in biology. Now, clearly, I know nothing about biology. I gave it up at 14. So I was telling them about my kind of random walk through my career path. And I said, you never know how what you're doing today might come in useful in the future. And I'm now reaching back into some work I did when I was at Arup back in 2008, but I did update the dates. So this is data that's come from the 2023 Housing Survey, which is the most recent one I could find. We have 25.4 million households, of which 64% are owner-occupied, 19% are privately rented, and the rest live in some kind of social housing. So we've got 16 million individual homeowners, plus 4.7 million in the private rented sector, and 4 million in some kind of housing association or local authority accommodation, which means that we are dealing with upwards of probably 18 million property owners. And we're trying to wrangle all of them into some kind of coherent, coordinated action. As Paul alluded to, they are huge diversity of age. So nearly 9 million of our homes were built before the end of the Second World War. Another 9 million or so were built between the Second World War and 1980, and then a much smaller proportion built since 1980. So we have a huge range of building codes. Many of them were built before building codes were even invented. We have a huge range of skills and technologies that were available at the time that these houses were built. And we also have a huge range of different property types. So we have everything from small and medium-sized terraced houses, semi-detached, detached, and bungalows. And then we have converted flats, so these are any of the previous things that have been converted into flats, or purpose-built flats, and high-rise buildings. So we've got a lot of different morphologies to grapple with as well. So this is a challenge of bringing lots of people together into to tackle a problem that is kind of multivariate in its form as well. So how do we do that? Well, I think there's a few key things that we need to do in order to really deliver this. And again, it's nearly all about people for me. So we've got to build confidence in the supply chain because we need a skilled supply chain. We've got to invest in the skills for those suppliers. And we've got to build trust among those many, many property owners and build trust and confidence for them. So how do we do that? Well, I think the first thing is that we've got to aggregate demand. So I've called this community buying schemes. And I'm not saying this is the only way to do this, but I think this is a really powerful approach. So one of the things we've got to do is aggregate demand and potentially segment demand by locality and property type to give the supply chain the confidence to invest in upskilling, recruiting people, building their capacity. If we do that, for example, through some sort of community-based scheme, then we can let frameworks, for example, to groups of vetted supply chain practitioners. And that gives us a framework of trusted providers, which again helps the householders, who are the next people in the category, to feel that A, they've got a trusted supply chain, B, they can get advice as to what needs to happen to their home, because even I, as an engineer, a fellow of the Institution of Civil Engineers, I look at my 1930s property and I'm like, well, I've got a rough idea what to do, but I don't really know where to start. I certainly don't know who to employ to do it. And it all falls into the too hard pile for me. So if you can go to some sort of scheme, then you can buy into that scheme, and actually all of the hard work is done by someone else. But also there's a reputational piece there, because if the supplier doesn't do a good job, you can complain to the organisation that recruited that supplier to do that work for you. So they've got a reputational skin in the game, that they're not just going to walk off the job and go, oh well, because they've got a whole load of other jobs relying on this. So it creates confidence for both householders and for the supply chain. Now, there's a number of different ways that you can do this kind of demand aggregation. I've talked about community buying schemes here, but one of the reasons that I think that is so powerful is because actually I've had experience of it myself. So in Cambridgeshire, where I live, the county council invested in or facilitated a community buying scheme for solar power. It was so easy. Basically, they leafleted every house, presumably in the county. If you were interested, you sent them an email or you rang them up. And then they asked you some questions about your property. They had a quick look, presumably on Google Maps, to check if it was pointing in the right direction. And if they thought you were likely to be suitable, then they would send a survey around. But before they sent the survey around, you had to commit something like £80 or something, just to kind of filter out people who might be just mucking about. And then if the surveyor came round and said, yes, we could do this, and this is the number of panels, etc., that would fit, then you were into the system, and you could either accept the quote or not. If you didn't accept the quote, you lost your £80. If you did accept the quote, it went towards the cost. And that meant that I now have 6 solar panels on my roof. If I'd had to do that from ground zero, even though I'm someone with a PhD in an engineering subject, and I in theory can grapple with the complexity of the system, I wouldn't have done it. But it was made so easy for me. All I basically had to do was send an email and cough up £80, and then obviously save the money to do the big job. But I didn't have to do any of the rest of it. And when something went wrong with it, the guy who'd installed it came straight back out to check it, because he had reputational skin in the game, and he really wanted to have a good reputation in this work. So I think, as I say, most of what I've talked about is not to do with technology, it's to do with people. It's about making sure that people have confidence to invest, that they have the mechanisms to engage with each other, and they have the mechanisms to actually get on and do the job in a way that is as reduced friction as it's possible to be. And I think that was everything I wanted to say, so thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. So our second speaker is Helene Gosden. Helene Gosden initiated Arup's Retrofit at Scale Taskforce, which she now leads. The Taskforce is tackling the system challenge of retrofitting UK housing at a scale to meet net zero commitments, while aiming to deliver community benefits through a place-based approach. Helen and her team of nearly 40 colleagues are actively supporting local authorities to retrofit over 100,000 social rented properties throughout England.
Fab. Evening, everybody, and thank you for having me. I'm Helene Gosden. I'm going to share my thoughts about the combined role of social science and engineering in decarbonisation of housing, based on the fact that I have lived and breathed housing decarbonisation for the last couple of years, partly to do with the background that Paul's just outlined. Arup took a decision a few years ago now to invest some resource in understanding how we as a multidisciplinary consultancy could do more to have a positive impact on the pace and scale of housing decarbonisation in the UK. So the Taskforce was established. I head up the Taskforce, and I've been working to establish an internal network and also think about how we impact externally. And part of that journey has been our involvement in the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero's Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund and Home Upgrade Scheme, Home Upgrade Grant Schemes, which is the 100,000 homes that Paul just alluded to. So I lead the technical assessment work stream. We are trying to support the grant recipients who are local authorities, housing associations and charities for the most part to deliver their plans. And hopefully that's helpful context for what I'm about to share. Decarbonisation of homes and our communities is a systems challenge. What that means and why it's important in our approach and ultimately our success is something that I'd just like to talk about in a little bit more detail. So some of you might be familiar with a systems kind of thinking, but the definition, for those who aren't, is that it's a complex problem that arises from interactions and relationships within a system. rather than being a simple isolated issue. So, for example, we know what we have to do technically to decarbonise a home. That's the isolated issue. But if only it were that simple. And as Jennifer has just alluded to, there are all sorts of other considerations. Who pays for the work? How do we deliver it? How do we convince people to let us over the threshold to do the work in the first place? So our starting point in the Taskforce was to consider the key challenges within that system. And we came up with 6 focus areas within the web, which we might use to focus our efforts and start to unpick some of those knots. So the first was data, how to understand the baseline condition of our stock. As Paul described, we have a very varied and not particularly well-performing building stock in the UK from a housing point of view. How do we understand that baseline condition and then measure improvement? And ideally what we want to do is create a positive feedback loop. The second point is finance. Who pays and how do we demonstrate value and return on investment? Particularly, this is a challenge in the private rental sector where you have this split incentives issue between the landlord who pays for the work potentially and the tenant who is the person who's going to benefit from it. Third is the supply chain, which Jennifer's alluded to, how we overcome fragmentation and encourage investment, particularly from small and micro enterprises who are typically working in that able-to-pay market, as we call it. The fourth is neighbourhoods, how we enable communities and support action from the bottom up, and I'm going to come back to communities. Fifth being materials, and that we always need to be mindful that we are layering additional embodied carbon into these homes as we retrofit them. And so we need to think about where we can find the marginal gains because they will add up when we scale. And the final point is human behaviour and the user experience, the customer journey. Because ultimately these aren't just assets, they're homes. And we need to make retrofit aspirational and accessible and eventually the norm. So I think hopefully those 6 points I've shared them because I think you're already starting to see how engineering is just a very small part of that challenge. We've come to think about scale in 3 different ways. The first is scaling action, doing more retrofit faster across portfolios of buildings defined by asset owners, archetypes or location, approaching the challenge programmatically to drive both scale and pace. Second point is scaling outcomes. I believe that housing sits at the nexus of climate change and social equity. There are so many benefits to good housing, and thinking as broadly as possible about those reasons to intervene means more action and more benefits from those interventions. We have thriving, more socially equal populations, we have meaningful climate transition and resilience, and jobs. All those are possible outcomes of retrofit at scale. And then the third point is scaling projects to the scale of neighbourhoods where action and outcomes can multiply benefits, embracing the collective transition we need for people to thrive and to ensure our planetary boundaries across the energy systems, transport and the green infrastructure alongside the buildings. I've only got one other slide, which is, I acknowledge, very dense, has come from a publication we produced, but it's kind of deliberately shared here because what we're trying to do is map the system across a neighbourhood and to bring in the physical assets and enable us to better visualise and understand the benefits associated with the system and how the outcomes scale. The key is that when you consider community as really anything more than 1 or 2 homes, the benefits start to scale exponentially. So you might have, for example, the potential for microgrids and demand-side flexibility to reduce demand on the grid. You've got the reduced burden on health and social care, which is derived from providing warmer homes in winter and cooler homes in the summer. And you've got the reduced urban heat island effect of community adaptation. So investment in more green areas, shading, and less cooling in buildings. And a point that I want to make here actually is also I'm very heavily involved in a lot of the conversation about retrofit, and there's lots of talk about co-benefits, but I think we increasingly are keen to emphasise that these are not co-benefits. These are the core benefits of retrofit at scale and decarbonisation of communities. So on to the Warm Homes Plan. My view is that the Warm Homes Plan needs to place an emphasis on communities in order to really maximise those benefits, and it's really, I've heard that narrative coming from central government as well, which is brilliant. And this is really why social science and engineering are integral parts of the same project. We also can look at Social Housing Decarb Fund and the Home Upgrade Grant. These are the flagship programmes of DESNZ. They're world leading in terms of the scale that they're trying to achieve. And they are evolving into the Warm Homes Plan, Social Housing Fund, and Warm Homes Local Grant. SHDF supports local authorities and housing associations. The Home Upgrade Grant is channeled through local authorities, but it is aimed at low-income privately owned homes. Over the last 2 years, we've seen that although admittedly not the only critical success factor for SHDF, is tenant engagement, bringing tenants on the journey and helping them to understand how the disruption will benefit them, reduce their bills, improve their comfort and their health. It's all about hearts and minds. The grant recipients that recognise the value of this and plan it early and integrate it into their delivery have much less resistance, greater satisfaction, and as I mentioned before, it's creating this positive feedback loop, which makes the conversations easier the next time round. And in parallel for the Home Upgrade Grant, the key challenge for the local authorities is identifying the homes that are eligible, because those homes don't belong to the local authority, but then engaging the homeowner and retaining them in the customer journey. The conversion rate from an expression of interest on HUG, the Home Upgrade Grant, to completed retrofit is really quite low. And you sort of have to ask yourself why, because in theory, the grant funding has effectively taken finance and to a large extent supply chain away as barriers, and yet people are still saying no. And so what remains is that human factor. Trust is key, and so is awareness. And so in terms of what we can do and hopefully see through the Warm Homes Plan, we need to focus on trust and we need to focus on awareness. These things came out already in the conversation before the presentations this evening. But trust is about relationships and building on quality of delivery and good communication. And we need an army of advocates in our communities. There are amazing community organisations. We're working with just a handful of them, whose energy needs to be harnessed and it needs to be supported, and they need to be connected so that they're not all trying to climb the same mountain in their own sort of space. And then there's awareness, because decarbonisation and net zero is quite abstract if you're not a technical person working in this space. And we're starting to feel the effects of climate change, fortunately not to the extent of other parts of the globe. But what we need is an awareness campaign to leverage our understanding of human behaviour, to think about nudge theory. And in a workshop that I was in the other week, they were talking about almost taking a brand insights approach with market segmentation, and that was DESNZ were in the room for those conversations too. What we want to create is a pervasive, long-term strategy that means that when people's understanding grows, and when the knock on the door comes, they want to say yes. And then they'll tell their friends to say yes. And then slowly it makes the work of the community groups much easier, and you build this kind of critical mass. Which might all sound quite a long way off from where we are now, but I just wanted to share a little anecdote from Sarah Edmonds at the National Retrofit Hub, which I don't think she'll mind me sharing. She was recently in Ireland, where the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland have set up one-stop shops, where homeowners can access information, they can access funding, they can access that vetted supply chain that Jennifer was talking about earlier. It's EU funded, and it's a slightly different delivery model to what we're able to deliver here. But my point here is about behaviour, because Sarah had a conversation with a taxi driver. She told him what she was doing, and he started talking about the fact that he'd got the wrapper for his home, they'd done the fabric improvement, and he was starting to think about whether they should get the pump as well. So the fact that the taxi driver, who had no engagement with her at a professional level, was interested and enthused to talk about this stuff, I think really speaks volumes. And closer to home in Bristol, City Council are looking at whether they can use their existing successful SHDF delivery vehicle, which is kind of going street by street, because they have relatively few social housing landlords that are able to do that, to drive uptake across tenure. What they want to be able to do is go down a street, and when they knock on the door, people who are other tenures start to sign up as well. And they're able to benefit from slightly reduced rates because all the overheads are already covered from the social housing work. So the workshop that we had, we came back again and again to this need to raise awareness. I was going to say one more thing on the topic, but I'll maybe save it for the Q&A. Just to conclude then, I think that housing decarbonisation is about the planet, but as Jennifer mentioned, it's also about people. And that's absolutely why we need to bring together the technical expertise with the deep understanding of the human behaviour to succeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Helena. Moving on, and there's some good messages coming out, so I can remind everybody for questions. Go to Slido or start writing them down in the room because we're going to need them in a minute. We're going to move on to our third speaker, which is Chris Wise. Professor Chris Wise. Chris Wise is a Senior Director for Expedition Engineering and the Useful Simple Trust, both of which he co-founded. He's been a long-time leader in sustainable and regenerative design and has been involved in many stadia, long-span, cultural and adaptive reuse projects for over 30 years. He's currently a visiting professor at Cambridge and Bath, specialising in architecture and regenerative design, respectively. Chris.
It's always nice to get a clap before you actually start. Okay, where are we? I'll set my starter. Okay, so I'm glad that the two previous speakers have spoken a lot about housing, because I'm not going to speak much about housing. I'm going to talk about design, and I'm going to talk about designers and what we can do to try and hopefully put a bit of confidence into people that there are practicing engineers, architects, even contractors, dare I say, and manufacturers who are trying to tackle this at the coalface in physical reality so that people can actually, and nature can actually use the products, and hopefully in a better way than we have done in the last 150 years, let's say, during the Industrial Revolution. So our task is basically to turn the we call it degenerative curve, where we're raiding the planet for a little bit more than it can sustain, and turn that curve upwards so we become net positive in terms of the outcomes. And I like Jennifer's outcomes as part of the expression of what she was trying to do. So systems integration. It is not very well integrated at the moment. And so this is a slide from a study done by the University of Cambridge, which I chaired their industrial steering group for this project, which one of the little pieces of work they did was look at, if you designed a building in a city centre, 10,000 square metre building, and used the 4 codes for ventilation, space planning, fire and structures to work out how many people could occupy that building, you got wildly different numbers. So ventilation would allow you to put 3,000 people in the building, space planning 3,750, fire 7,500, although that may now go down after Grenfell. But in structural engineers, over-design the building to the point that 85,500 people can go in there. Those are all, and all of those professionals would think they're doing a perfectly good job, and they're completely not integrated. It's absolutely crazy. And the reason for that is something called bounded rationality. So bounded rationality is putting a complicated subject into a bounded box, which makes it sufficiently well contained and under control, a bit like a naughty pet, that you can actually study it and test yourself on it, and then hopefully qualify in it and become a professional. But the problem is all those boxes, so there might be mechanical engineering, structural engineering, architecture, economics, all sorts of things, biodiversity of one sort or another, but the boxes are not connected together. So the task that we've set ourselves is really to join all those boxes together. So the systems integration of those boxes, and also the arrows point outwards because it's things which we don't know about yet, or that we haven't even thought about including, are the ones that we need to incorporate in this. And so as time has gone by, the world has become more complicated, and there become more and more boxes with more and more specialisms, and the whole pile of boxes has become more and more unstable to the point that it frequently threatens to topple over. And even if you put regenerative design and time and biodiversity and all those things into it. So I think a much better way of tackling it is to layer the systems over each other in a way, and this is a slide, this on the right-hand side is from Ian McHarg, who wrote a book called Design with Nature in 1969, set up a design consultancy on the back of it, and his whole piece was to look at not just the physical systems that interacted at a place, but also things like crime, poverty, well-being, health, and those sorts of things, and try to tease together or tease out the connections between those systems in a way that enables, as a effectively a landscape and architecture practice, that they wanted to try to do something where they weren't conflicting with the systems, but they were actually supporting them and trying to encourage their development or their co-development. Connecting things together. So this is Arup has got, we all work for Arups at one point or another. Everybody does, I think. So, but I worked on the Millennium Bridge of infamy, and but the slide on the top right-hand corner is a prediction that was made in 1999 of the number of people who would go from the north of the river to the south of the river. So the more intense the color, the more people are moving. And on the right-hand side is the prediction of what would happen if we built a bridge between St. Paul's and the south bank of the river. And the prediction was 4 million people a year would use the Millennium Bridge. Actually, 8 million people a year are using the Millennium Bridge, and there's every chance that might go up. The bridge has a design life of 120 years. So over its life, that is 1 billion people going to use that bridge. And 1 billion people making connections, 1 billion people going to work, 1 billion people not using cars or other forms of fossil fuel-powered transport, joining communities together, and all that sort of thing. So it's actually a very small project to have that impact, but that's what we are able to do if we manage to choose our projects wisely. And I wanted to put this up, and it was it goes back to what was being said earlier. So with the 1851 Commission, Alison Nimmo and I are both commissioners with the 1851 Commission, and we are co-chairing something called South Kensington Plus, which is South Kensington Albertopolis, basically. All the 23 institutions at Albertopolis, so all the museums, Imperial College, and everybody, trying to do a neighborhood scale net zero, circular economy, sustainable transport, and nature positive project, all together. And we've been doing it for 3 years so far, and we're making significant strides. One of the first things we've done, though, is to, as was mentioned earlier, you need data in order to know whether you're making any strides at all. So the first thing we've done is emissions data for all of the institutions, which we're now tracking. So a lot of them didn't know how they sat relative to good practice or best practice. We're doing biodiversity surveys this year, so to get a benchmark for biodiversity through the whole thing, from the park down to the new garden at the Natural History Museum. You can read a lot more about it, but the point I'm making is that all of those institutions have chosen to participate in that at a very senior level, and they give an awful lot of time up to work together because they realize they can do more together than they would have done separately. And one of the things they're doing is a sustainable procurement charter, so they can actually buy goods and services which come from organizations which have a sustainable supply chain, which also is cheaper because they have economies of scale. So very good. Natural design, I've called it that, just by way of saying, so this is a 30-year-old project. I did do this at Arups, this is the world's first green skyscraper, which you might say is a tautology, probably. But it's naturally ventilated, naturally lit. It is broken down into little villages, village communities within the building of about 60 people, which is a good social size. And it reduced the operational energy of the building by about 40 to 50% compared to conventional fossil fuel buildings at the time. So that was, and it had 12 weather stations, so it was semi-intelligent in terms of the way it responded to the external environment. And it even learned by people's behavior about opening the naturally ventilated windows, whether or not it was doing well or badly relative to the outside temperature. That sort of technology has been around for donkey's years, and we don't have it you mentioned the 1930s semi-detached house. It doesn't have much of that technology in it today, but we easily could have, of course. And an even more simple one, the American Air Museum, which is another project we did about that time, is two very thin concrete shells which act like a massive thermal buffer, like being inside a cathedral in the summer. So if it's a hot day outside, you're cooler inside because the building itself acts as a thermal store to keep to balance out daytime and nighttime temperatures. And it's also naturally lit, has almost no active heating, cooling, or dehumidification, and almost no lighting during daytime. So this is naturally lit interior of a 90-meter span space without any lights on. Lean design, which is, so use what you need and no more, is a thing which people do not do, as we could see from the codes of practice, for example, but also because a lot of technologists put a bit of a sleep at night factor in, especially in the built environment, because it's a commercial business. People don't have time, let's say, to iterate their designs as much as they would like to, if I'm being charitable. So they tend to over-design. And again, the Mycon study at Cambridge found that they were over-designing by their own admission by about 25 to 30%, which is rather scary. So lean design, we did the velodrome for the Olympics, and it uses, these are principles which are going to go back thousands of years. We use the geometry of the building, or the geometry of the structure, to make it act efficiently. So the roof is like a wet tennis, an old-fashioned wooden tennis racket which is warped when it's raining. So you get double curvature, which makes it unbelievably stiff and strong and very light. And the walls of the seating bowl are doubly curved, and they act as a stiff structure, a bit like a coracle or a boat. So we won that competition, built the velodrome. It's, by most reckonings, the most sustainable project on the Olympic Park, but certainly the roof is super, super, super light. And as I say, it was put up without, it's basically 36 millimeter cables spanning 130 meters in both directions because of that double curvature. Adaptive design, so how do you take what you already have and adapt it at a scale which is more than just houses, but the community, the city. This is Stuart Brand's book, How Buildings Learn, which is a fantastic book. But he basically layers the lifetime of the parts of projects according to whether it's the site, which lasts a long time, and it goes through the skin, the structure, and eventually the stuff, which are the things like this, which you get rid of and change every few years. And there's an increasing awareness now. So Vinted apparently is the most the clothing recycling organization is the largest fashion retailer in France at the moment now compared to any new. So there's an increasing interest in recycling, repurposing, including repurposing buildings like this one we did in Baker Street, which saved 13,000 tons of carbon. That's equivalent to roughly 13,000 trips to the States by jet. We did the same thing, something similar in Barcelona. And I wanted to put this in, which is a project we're doing now with Lower Thames Crossing, or at least we're trying to do with Lower Thames Crossing, which is to use, not to use new steel, but to use steel which has been taken from old buildings and is then repurposed to turn itself from a building into a bridge. I want to put something in about folly, because there's a lot of design follies around. This one is 1,907 feet tall in Oklahoma. It's the tallest skyscraper in the United States, and this is it. 24. If you compare building a building like that to building a low-rise building, it's 24 times the amount of material for the columns and for the stability structure that you'd have for a low-rise building. So, and it's not. Why? It's surrounded by 10-story buildings or less. Absolutely crazy. And on the same day that that was published, there was a note in the Evening Standard that said 600 more London skyscrapers to transform the city skyline. And right next to it shows how much, let's say, inconsistency and, let's say, lack of knowledge there is. Right next to it, the Evening Standard had put a note saying, not only are there going to be 600 more London skyscrapers, which are really, really carbon heavy, but the flood wall, Thames Barrier flood walls, and the Thames Barrier and the flood walls are going to have to rise because global warming is making sea levels rise, and we're all going to sink. Anyway, I could go on forever. Last thing. This, I promise, is the last thing. My aspiration when you're designing things is to say, if you imagine you're trying to put something into a state of equilibrium, whoops, and I'm trying to put my phone into equilibrium, if I keep on having to push it, I have to use energy and a system to make it stable, because it's unstable when it's standing up. If I hang it downwards, and I move it, it's stable. So we should be designing things which set themselves into a naturally stable equilibrium and not force ourselves to do something which is naturally unstable, which requires a lot of energy and support infrastructure in order to keep it into its equilibrium position, because that is very, very inefficient. Right.
Great, thanks so much indeed, Chris. We're going to go online, I believe, now. We're going to be joined by Professor Mari Martiskainen. Excellent, as if by magic. You're here, wonderful. Professor Mari Martiskainen is a Professor of Energy and Society based at the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex. She is the Director of Energy Demand Research Centre and also led the Equity and Justice theme at the Centre for Research into Energy Demand Solutions between 2020 and 2023. Mari is a social scientist with a specific interest in sustainability transitions and just transitions to a net zero society. Mari, over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for allowing me to join online this evening. I have been in Birmingham for the last 2 days, talking about specifically how we can move to a low energy society in the UK. So I'm still in Birmingham today. So thank you so much for allowing me to, join online. And I have to make a disclaimer at the beginning. I have not worked at Arup before, so I'm an academic, so I don't have that engineering background. So first of all, I just wanted to highlight that obviously the reason why we are here and why we are talking about warm homes is that we have to make sure that we make our homes also resilient in the face of climate change. And this is a picture, unfortunately, that I took in January of BBC News when the wildfires in Los Angeles were happening. And I think it's a really, really devastating image of what's actually happening already now. So when we are talking about warm homes, we also have to think about that, we have to make our homes resilient for the future. And I want to also highlight that despite some of the perhaps recent political trends, there is actually a huge amount of support from people in terms of acting on climate. So, for example, the UNDP has found that 80% of people globally want their country to do more on climate change, and 72% want their country to move away from fossil fuels. So these are really very positive statistics, and particularly looking at people's willingness to contribute on things like their personal income, for example. So I think it's really important that we make a very clear link that low carbon homes are actually needed because climate change is happening, and that link hasn't yet been always made. So I think we have to be mindful of the fact that lots of people want to take action on climate change, and it's really important that we make the link that actually we can do that by addressing our homes as well. And I want to also highlight that when we are talking about homes, it's really important to sort of think about that. Are we just thinking about bricks and mortar? For me, as a social scientist, I'm also always thinking about behavior. So behavior inside and outside of the homes. So when we are starting to think about warm homes, for example, or warm homes plans, do we need to consider issues like rebound effect? For example, I'm not going to go into that much detail this evening, but I'm sure many of you have heard that concept before. And I was asked to also touch on just transitions in the context of homes. And I come from a sustainability transitions background in terms of my research portfolio. And I could spend a lot of time talking about, what is a just transition. But I want to give you just a couple of ideas on that. So just transition is something which simultaneously addresses inequalities while we are moving towards low carbon interventions that actually look at prioritizing restoration, reconstruction, and redistributive justice. So there are a real sort of theoretical concepts behind this. And we can think about it as a kind of instrumental way. So thinking about just transitions, for example, in the phase of what does it mean when we move away from fossil fuels? What does it mean for labor, for example? What does it mean for jobs and skills? And I'm glad that previous presenters already brought those up, that, this is also about jobs and skills. But it's also about perceptive issues. So justice is very subjective to people. So what does it mean if we want to have a just transition into warm and sustainable and low carbon homes? So I think it's really important to think about that justice can be also quite perceptive in terms of who is thinking about it. And in that context, I think when we are talking about homes, and particularly thinking about homes, decarbonizing homes, I think it's really important to think about whose homes are we talking about. And previous speakers have talked about social housing, for example, or homeowners, or the number of homes that we have in the UK, for example. So who are the people that we are actually expected to take action in this space? Are they homeowners? Are they tenants? Are they landlords? So I think it's really important to recognize that, people have very different starting points in terms of improving their homes or making their homes more warmer or more cooler in a heating planet. So it's very important to think about that people have a different level of awareness. They have a different level of willingness, and they also have a different level of capacity to do that. And here we have found in research by colleagues in our centre, for example, that trusted relationships are really, really important. And for example, in the UK, people tend to trust most of the people that they already know. So they actually trust their social networks a lot more than they, for example, trust the government or business or the media. So I think in that sense, it's really important that we create this sort of better confidence in low carbon homes, and using particularly the kind of trust that already exists in social relations that people might have. Benefits has been mentioned before, and we've actually spent a lot of time with my team talking about that, are these co-benefits? Are they core benefits? I think anybody outside of academia or like policy sphere just thinks about benefits. So let's just call them benefits. So I think it's really important that we make benefits of low carbon homes very clear. It's about warm homes, cool homes, cleaner air, better well-being, reduced energy bills, even energy security. So there are so many different benefits that lower carbon homes can bring. And I think it's very important that we communicate that really clearly. And in terms of when we talk about the homes themselves, I think it's also really important that we communicate in clear terms. So I would say, forget about kilowatt hours, forget about terms like retrofit. If I speak to some of my friends, for example, who are not in academia or not in energy sort of geek space, if I mention to them the terms retrofit, they will just, think like, what do you actually mean by that? So terms like net zero, retrofit, kilowatt hours, what does that actually mean in practice and everyday life for people when they are thinking about their homes? And here it's also really important to think about that we all have very strong emotional links to our homes, and we are also very irrational oftentimes when we are thinking about our homes. The TV is full of decluttering programs, for example, and I have a good example from a previous project where a community organization was helping to retrofit, sorry for using the term retrofit now, but was helping to do insulation, for example, for people. And they said that they actually ended up spending a lot of time just clearing out people's lofts. So there are a lot of sort of emotional aspects that we need to think about when we are starting to refurbish people's homes or improve people's homes. And in the sort of just transitions mindset, we have to also think about fairness and inclusion. We have to think about who is paying for this, who is benefiting from this. The UK has a high rate of fuel poverty, for example. What does it mean for people who might already be in fuel poverty or at risk of fuel poverty? Where do they sit in this plan? And I'm really pleased that community has already been mentioned in previous presentations. And as part of our centre, the Energy Demand Research Centre, we are looking at place-based case studies, particularly think about whether place-based action can actually help towards better homes, whether it can help in just transitions. So we are, for example, looking at neighborhood-level, community-led home energy projects that are addressing challenges such as this kind of relational support that might be needed in terms of with trust, finding the skills in locally, finding the kind of supply chain. So we're looking at case studies with this. We are also going to welcome spaces, which are these community spaces that were set up during the energy price crisis, particularly in 2022. And a lot of them have since then they've been going on, and they are sharing advice on energy as part of some of their other activities. So they really provide some really good spaces for people to come and actually learn about energy transitions, learn about energy advice, but also actually go to a space where there is a trusted person that can help you with that. And a lot of these initiatives take time and effort. And we, for example, interviewed one particular place where somebody was going to a welcome space, and it took them a year to actually, they have the courage to say that they needed help with their energy bill, for example, or that their home was not in a good condition. So all of this takes time, and it takes building relationships. And a lot of these initiatives are a lot more about than just energy. So we need to think about beyond heat pumps and electric vehicles, because not everybody can have an electric vehicle, not everybody drives, not everybody is thinking about, is there space for a heat pump if they live in a flat, for example. So our kind of initial findings from these particular case studies are showing that there are many people who are not taking part in the energy transition for various reasons. They want to take part, but they cannot take part yet. And there are a lot of programs, and it's a real myriad of different grant schemes, even for the sort of organizations that are helping people. And it seems like there's a lot of help for people who might be on a low income, and then there are lots of programs, or maybe not programs needed for people who just have the financial capital to do the measures. So there is a lot of people in the middle that don't actually have any grant programs available for them, but they also don't have the financial capital available for them. So it's the kind of missing middle that we need to really address and get those people on board. And there is a kind of still a little bit of a disconnect between the complex government policy and the really positive local action that we are seeing in our case studies. And we do think that, while these spaces can provide really trusted action, they do require lots of time and resource and specific skills, and particularly people skills, in addition to the technical knowledge that you need on some of the very complex building aspects. So this is my almost last slide. So I'm just going to highlight again that we really need to recognize the different starting points that people have for creating low energy homes. We need to be aware of, who can take action. The trusted social relationships are a really key part when people consider changes in their homes. And having a change in the home can be very, very disruptive, like what was mentioned previously by previous speakers. So we need to think about who's the best to facilitate those sort of relationships and those kind of perhaps maybe sometimes difficult situations as well. And we also need to remember that this is a collective effort. So we need to do this across society, and it really needs clear government leadership. And that's something that we are seeing from our research as well, that people want to take action, but they actually want to be also, they want very clear messages of what they need to do and to make sure that other people are doing this as well. And just to finalize, you all know that we need to act because of climate change, and we do think that there is a huge potential in improving our homes with multiple benefits on jobs and skills, careers, particularly future careers for young children who are now thinking about what shall I do in a few years' time when I go to secondary school, for example, or doing my GCSEs or A levels. Where do I want to go to university, or do I want to go to more into a practical career? That there's huge amount of opportunities across all different career stages in this. It's about lower bills, better comfort, And finally, we are already seeing an energy transition, but it's really important to recognize that not everybody is taking part yet, and not everybody is able to take part. And it's really important that we change that and we make sure that everybody is actually taking part in the collective effort that we need towards low carbon homes. So thank you. I'll leave it at that.
Speakers to come to the stage. So I encourage those of you online again to join us on Slido to put some questions. We'll come to questions in the room as well. Just let the speakers get settled. Excellent. That was a very, very, to use a civil service phrase, rich discussion, but some really strong themes, I think, coming through there. Themes around how much of this is both a social and an engineering challenge, how we need a systems approach in order to do that. This is not about co-benefits, it's about benefits, would seem to be a strong message. Messages around design, the role that design can play in this. The role of how we need people at the centre. This is people-centric, but we've got to recognise that this is irrational, not a rational problem as well, and communities. I wrote down complex government policy and translation into action. I can't believe any government policy is complicated, but a real message, I think, there as well. So let's move to questions, and for the panel, are there any questions? Gentleman there in grey at the front.
Thanks very much. I'm Adam Cooper from UCL, Department of Science, Technology, Engineering, Public Policy. I've been working in this area for about 10 years. I was the former head of social science engagement at DEC back about 10 years ago. And I just wonder if the panel starts to see this in the same way that I've started to see it as a social scientist, which is that we, back then and today, we're still seeing the world in two ways: the engineering way and the societal or social way. Where the social world is kind of full of kind of awareness, lack of knowledge, trust, and the engineering world just needs kind of better technologies to get out there and to be designed, and we somehow need to put the two together. And I wonder if the true heart of this problem is actually at the interface between the two. And what we're not focusing on is the need to bring social science into not just design at the kind of the broad level, but at the engineering technical design of the objects and technologies to allow them to be deployed in ways that actually help people rather than help the engineer or help the building or help suppliers in some way.
Super. So really, are we separating these things too much? There's a chat really waving at me, so I presume that you really want to come in on this point before I come to the panel. Is that right? All right. Okay.
I'll wait till you.
You'll wait. Okay, super. So, Chris, I'll start with you. False dichotomy, social engineering. You need to integrate them.
Yeah, I think so. I've been trying to write a report on regenerative design for the last 3 years, and I found that I can't write it because every time I look at it, it's about the relationships between human beings, regardless of their discipline and what their shared value sets are. And for that you need an understanding of context. Very broad context, and everybody comes with a different understanding of what is important. And so where we're missing in this discussion, I think, is in finding a meeting ground, which does build on communication, as somebody mentioned. One of the comments was a meeting ground where people can actually say what's important to them, get it on the table, see that it's being taken seriously, but also at the same time listen to what other people think is important for them as well. And there's going to have to be some sort of moderation. It could be in the nicest possible way moderation, in the worst possible way maybe arm wrestling between the participants to fight for what the purpose of a intervention or a project should actually be. That doesn't really exist. What happens is it tends to be top-down, dictatorial. The brief is written by the client who has a narrow vested interest, or by a government department who may have a narrow vested interest. And the people who are actually going to be the end users or people who are going to try and design or make or operate these things into the future are not really given the chance to express what they think is possible. And I think that we're stuck in this situation where we don't know what we want until we know what we can have. So people ask for something. There are people around who probably could say, well, you didn't ask for this, but you could have this. Is that something you'd prefer? An alternative future. And we need to enable those voices to come to the surface.
Super. Helene, any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I was initially just thinking to myself about bringing the voice of the user into the design process a bit more, and then reflecting on how it was possible to bring all of those different perspectives in when you're talking about all those different sort of demographics that might be part of the housing decarbonisation challenge. But then that triggered a thought in my mind about participatory design, and I was just reflecting on, again, in a really good example of where I've seen the community engaged early on through Civic Square do amazing things, where they actually get together with the community, help them to understand what the range of potential outcomes might be, before they then kind of hone in on what it is they actually want, and then that starts to inform the design process. And it is a different way of thinking about design, and it challenges how, I'm a structural engineer by background, a sort of typical building design process, that's not how it functions. But I think there's a huge opportunity there to do more. But again, we're talking about the skills that are required to achieve this. That sort of approach, the sort of systems thinking side of things, is something that we need to develop more as well.
Excellent. Jennifer, your perspective on this question?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. I think in general, I'm starting to see the conversation between the disciplines happen more. I think there's a real challenge with how we are trained. So I had a project where we were doing it out of the civil engineering department in Cambridge, but on our steering group, we invited a human geographer to be on the steering group, a brilliant woman called Charlotte Lemansky, and she's married to an engineer, so she said, okay, so I'm a social scientist, but don't worry, I can speak engineer. And the description she gave me of kind of how the two types of disciplines work, so the kind of science and engineering versus sort of social science and humanities, is that in science and engineering, we're taught to think in quite straight lines. There's a problem we need to solve, there's a solution we need to deliver, let's just get on and do it. On the flip side of it, social sciences are taught to understand the problem, and then once they understand the problem, they want to understand it some more, and then they find new problems to investigate. But you bring up the word solution to a social scientist, and it slightly, makes them shiver. But if we can bring these two together, so engineers aren't really taught to think about, is this the right problem to solve? It's just solve the problem. So, I need a bridge to cross the river. Brilliant, I'll design and build you a bridge, but you don't stop to say, well, do you need a bridge? Is a ferry a better answer? Actually, do we need to cross the river here at all? Would we be better off doing it somewhere else? Whereas social scientists are taught to explore the problem, but maybe not to address it in quite the same way. So I think we're getting better at breaking down these artificial human barriers that we've created between disciplines, to go back to your point about boxes. But we've still got quite a long way to go in actually learning to understand each other's language, even in different disciplines. And I think the other key thing about this, which goes back to what Mari and Helene were talking about, is we need to bring the solution design as close to the people as possible. Ideally, we have them participating in designing the solution, but we at least need the coordination of the solutions to be as local as possible. So I think sometimes we've seen, government funding initiatives fail to get uptake because it's all very centrally controlled and it expects individual humans to go and apply for stuff. Whereas when you vest the coordination in a local authority, for example, they know their population, they've got a much better idea of what the housing stock looks like, they understand, at least to some extent, the challenges that people face. So they're much better positioned to actually help deliver something and engage the people and kind of get that social perspective on board.
Thanks. Mari, do you have a perspective on this question?
Yes, I do. Thank you so much. So I direct a centre which is very interdisciplinary. So we are looking at energy demand across society, including buildings, transport and industry. And we have engineers, social scientists, geographers, modelers, people looking at health as well. I think health is also really important because when we are particularly thinking about homes, we need to make sure that we have healthy homes. So we definitely do need an interdisciplinary approach on this, and I think it's becoming more and more important now because some of it is actually quite complex. So yes, like Jennifer, you were saying that engineer might have a solution, but then the social scientists will come and say, well, actually, once you open the door into that home, it's not as simple and straightforward. So yeah, I think interdisciplinarity is really important.
Thanks very much. Really clear messages there, isn't there? That it really, you do need to integrate this, and we will actually go wrong if we separate it as part of this. So I'm going to go back to the room. I'm going to collect a couple of questions together now. Let's go to the panel. The chap who was flagging me very early and now has the microphone, I think.
Okay.
Thanks. Yeah, hi, Donald Brown from the University of Sussex. Full disclosure, I'm a colleague of Mari's. Hi, Mari. Looking like God on the screen there. So about 3 years ago, I work in Retrofit and did my PhD in the topic, and I was involved in house building before that. About 3 years ago, I was approached by Ed Miliband's team to write them a report about how we deliver on the housing retrofit agenda. Back then, Labour were committing £60 billion of public money to this agenda over 10 years, and actually Arup were involved and helped fund part of that work, so shout out to Helene and her team for that. We then saw in the spring of last year, prior to Labour obviously winning the election, that sum was cut substantially after, we thought we did all the right things. We talked about the benefits, we talked about economic growth, we talked about all of these, incredible things that a nationwide retrofit programme could bring, but the funding was significantly cut by the shadow Treasury team at that time. We're now, unfortunately, I'm in a working group with E3G looking at the current funding allocation of £13 billion, also likely to be being axed in part during the spending review. And this just leads me to think we all talk about the common sense of this issue. I've been doing this, I'm not that old, but I've seen this happen so many times where we all talk about why improving our housing stock is such a great idea, but government, time and again, and particularly Treasury, just do not seem to get this. And I just wondered what the panel's views are on why this keeps happening. So sorry, it's a bit of a gloomy one, but I think it does need to be confronted.
So the question is, what is the right amount to spend on this? We'll go to the lady in green and then the gentleman at the back. We'll collect those three and then we'll come down this side in a minute. Sir, I've seen you. Lady in the green top.
Thank you. Christina Aston, Aston Consulting. I'm an education consultant. I was listening to the 4 talks and wondering when young people might emerge from one of you. It struck then, Mary, actually you win the prize, so thank you very much mentioning careers and that green skills and so on. It strikes me that young people, of course, are going to be around for the longest, and we are talking about the long view here, as you made in your first point. But there is a huge amount of frustration amongst young people at the speed at which things are happening. Mary, I think you showed a picture of the school strike with Greta Thunberg. And of course, they are necessarily disconnected from decisions because they're young, so they will benefit eventually, but they can't yet pay and they can't yet make the decisions. And this also touches on the curriculum. So I'd really like to ask what the panel think the curriculum at schools should look like. At the moment, it is very boxed, to use Chris's analogy. It is very disciplinary and not very interdisciplinary. And frankly, they're more likely to learn about tidal power, which seems to me pretty largely irrelevant, and not at all about retrofitting or sustainable homes. So I'd love your view on education.
Thank you. So I'll just go to the chap at the back with his hand up in the suit and the tie, not Graham.
Paul, just while we're pulling over the mic, can I just say for anyone online, Slido was not working properly and it now is. So
right.
if you
Great.
haven't asked a question because you were annoyed, get asking on Slido now. Thanks.
Super. Thanks, Gavin.
Thank you. Andrew Mackenzie from the Physiological Society. I had a question particularly for Chris and some of the fantastic designs that you showed. And my question is, why don't we see more of these implemented? Is it a particular UK issue? Is it because they're much more expensive to design and build? Is it a lack of skills? Is it a lack of imagination? What's the reason that we don't see more of these reusable projects?
Great, thanks very much indeed. Three questions there. One around Warm Homes Plan, what is the right amount of money that we should be spending on retrofits, if I can put it like that. One about the role of young people in that, and one about reuse. So I'm going to come to Helene first to think about, well, you can choose which one you want to answer.
But I'll start with the unlocking the funding point, and I think I don't have the answer to what is the right amount of money, but I do want to come back to the point about data, and that's why we are sort of particularly involved in this monitoring outcomes and impact evaluation work stream that the National Retrofit Hub are sort of leading at the moment, because I feel I come back time and again to the need to demonstrate the outcome and to demonstrate the improvement, whether that is quantitative or qualitative, whether it is in tons of carbon, pounds on somebody's bill, or the health outcomes. If you can justify why the investment is required and show that there will be a return on investment, it makes so much more compelling case to request the funding in the first place. And I think I'm not sure that that is a place where we've really been before. So that's why I think it will I'm hoping that it will unlock quite a lot of conversation, at least. It will drive conversation further in the future.
Thanks. Jennifer.
So, yeah, I want to pick up on this from the perspective of Chris's boxes. We have created, this is sort of since Victorian times really, we've created disciplines and we've created departments of government and what have you, and we like to box ourselves into those things. What we don't recognise is that out there in the real world, those boxes don't exist. Okay? We have county boundaries, and we deal with our roads across county boundaries, and you can sometimes tell when you've gone from one county to another because the potholes get worse. But you and I, we just drive through these places. So these boundaries in reality don't exist. And the boundary between health and the condition of our homes, they're intimately linked together. And if we think about energy and warm homes completely separately from health, completely separately from well-being and everything else, then we're not taking the whole picture. So government likes, and as do all human organisations, this isn't just government. Government really likes its disciplinary boundaries, and it likes to not have to have cooperation between departments, because that gets messy and complicated. But the reality is we really need joined-up government in this space, because we need to understand, the things that we've called co-benefits, which, as Helene rightly said, are actually the core benefits of these things. We need to be offsetting that against, the potential health bill. The NHS is sucking up more and more money all the time because we're getting sicker. But if we're not taking a whole systems view of how health works, then that's only going to get worse. So we really need to join up our thinking across all of these complex things, and nobody likes doing that, but actually I think it's the only way we're going to crack this. So coming back to the point about why is it only 13 billion? Yeah, really good question, because actually if you look at the health benefit and the reduction potentially in the cost to the NHS, we should be putting more in, not less, I would say.
I wrote the very same thing today in a piece of advice, actually, about putting together warm homes and health. So nice to hear the point on the panel as well. Mary, we had a question about young people. Maybe you want to pick that one up, as you mentioned it?
Yes, thank you. I am doing some work actually with the European Youth Energy Network, and specifically they are looking at young people in different European countries that might be struggling with their energy bills. So they are looking at energy poverty and youth, and how young people are specifically affected by energy poverty, for example. But I totally agree that we do need to think about our curriculum, and we need to think about our educational settings, particularly for younger people. And this is something that colleagues of ours in the Energy Demand Research Centre are doing. So they are looking at this as one piece of work that is coming up. But it is certainly something that, there is a lot of activity going on. And I think it's important that we do listen to young people, and particularly in the design phase, because if we think about buildings and homes, these are going to be standing, like Chris mentioned before, they're going to be standing for hundreds of years. So I do think it's important that we do listen to young people and get their views on board. Can I quickly touch on the money?
Yeah, touch on the money, please do, yes. Always a good question about money, isn't it?
Yeah, so I don't have a figure in mind, but I do think that a lot of these are often political choices. Governments around the world spend billions, lots of money during the energy crisis. So there is willingness to spend money on certain things related to energy in a time of a crisis. And I think we need some longer term planning and thinking on this, so that we can then avoid the kind of energy bill hikes that happened during the 2022, for example. So, but yeah, it's about choice and when we make those choices.
Thanks very much. Helene, you want to come quickly in on the question of youth and...
Yeah,
quickly.
sorry, I just wanted to sort of reflect on the fact that I have been into a couple of schools locally to talk about what I do and what that means in kind of the bigger picture of climate change. And my reflection in working out what I was going to say, I've been to a junior school and I've been to a secondary school, is around finding that balance between of not wanting to exacerbate eco-anxiety by talking about how big the challenge is, but also talking about the things that we all need to do and we can do. And I think, just again, to come back to the community engagement piece, the importance of providing agency to everybody, not just the young people, but the communities, and feeling like they have the ability to make a difference is really important in addressing that kind of eco-anxiety piece. So I firmly believe that we should have all parts of society represented in that, perhaps in that participatory design process that we were talking about earlier.
I think that agency is really important, that this is part of the solution. We spend a lot of time talking about the problem, and that agency and solution-focused outcomes. Jennifer, you want to come quickly in on this?
Yeah, just quickly. So I think the curriculum is really important. I think the curriculum at primary school level is great because, yes, you learn reading and writing and all that good stuff, but then they do these amazing projects that bring a bit of everything in. So you study the Romans and you do science and you do engineering and you do history and you do everything around, you know, a topic. And then we get to secondary school and we split it all up and we disconnect everything and kids get bored. And actually, I think our young people are incredibly imaginative. And they've got really good opinions, and they're not boxed in the way that we all are because we've had that education and everything else. And so I think we should actually be engaging them more through things like, I mean, maybe not citizens' assemblies, but something like that, and actually getting their voices into the room to say, what is it we want, what do we want to see? And you can do this in really simple ways. So I've got a colleague at Lancaster University, Paul Curtin, and he's done gamification of urban planning, and he's had kids aged 7, 8 and 9 deciding what they want in their place. Now, you know, the extent to which that's actually come to reality, I don't know. But they can, you give them the evidence and you give them the tools, and actually they can make really good, balanced decisions. Obviously, they all want a playground to start with, but then, you know, they start to bring in other stuff as well. So I think we're not very good as a society at engaging our young people in those conversations and actually giving them the agency to have their voices heard. But we've got all the tools to do it, and we should do more of it.
So, Chris, any thoughts on those questions? There was one specifically on reuse there.
Well, there was a question about the design process and why there aren't more amazing designs out there, which that's more or less what you were asking at the back, I think. Is that right? Yeah. So I think it's because, well, first thing is language. We, engineers and to some extent architects, designers, speak in a language which is not understood by the people we're talking to. And they are speaking a language that we don't understand. So we need to develop a common language. I'll give you some examples. So stress, strain, fatigue, we design for collapse, we design for settlement. You know, every word we use is a defensive negative word, rather than saying we're going to fly over canyons, we're going to zoom over bumblebees, whatever we're going to do. There's no positivity about the language we're using. So if you're a politician and somebody's talking to you about stress and strain, that's not going to be particularly appetizing. So I think the engineers in particular, scientists as well, I think to some extent, need to think about positive language and use that all the time. And really simple. I really think Marie was right when she said, stop talking about retrofit or whoever it was. I think it was Marie. Stop talking about that sort of stuff because nobody understands what you're talking about. So that's the first one. Second thing is I think that we've stopped actually doing glory projects like those projects more or less in our practice. Not because we can't get them, because we can get them, but because we're focusing on the sort of middle ground stuff which affects millions of people. And we're so we're doing things like trying to redesign things that used to be made out of concrete and trying to make them out of something which is a tenth of the carbon footprint, for example, and then do 1 million of them. That's what we're trying to do, because that has a massive impact. So if you can design one amazing thing, quite small, Railway copers that make platforms, for example, which rot away under the salt. We're trying to extend the life. Those sorts of things. So we're trying to do millions of those, and we're trying to turn it from in the way that designers work. It's not a linear process. You can't write a Gantt chart for how we work and say start here, then go there, and on Thursday next week finish there. Well, actually, you can say finish there and we will finish. But it's a completely iterative process, and it's a conditional process. It depends on the steps you go through and the information that you can draw in, the people you talk to enable you to go past the first daft idea into a second idea which is not quite so daft, to one which is over there, and eventually, if you're a good designer, you start converging. But it's not a linear process, which is beloved of project managers and accountants. It's a completely, it does converge, but it's completely iterative. And there's an opportunity all the way through these projects for people to participate in those loops and bring their point of view. So if you're not involved at the beginning, it doesn't mean you can't be involved later on. The last thing to say is I think that on the education side, I think that we are taught that there's a right and a wrong answer, which is completely ridiculous. There might be a better answer and a not so good answer or a terrible answer, but there's certainly no right and wrong when you're looking at complex interactive systems. You've got to have something which is where the outcome is better by having really good integrated system-based thinking than you would get if you were going for a linear management process.
Excellent. Let's go back to the floor, and I've got Slido working as well now. There's a chap over here that had a question in the white shirt there. Can I ask, I'll channel my inner David Willits. Can we have sharp questions so we can get more of them? That'd be great.
Okay, my name is Bahaj, and I'm from the University of Southampton. I think we know so much about this area, and we spend so much money and effort in it. And I really don't know whether we know what the barriers are. Under Gordon Brown, we had an aspiration or maybe a plan to have net zero homes by 2016, which was scrapped. So is the barrier the politics or the money, or is the barrier the engineers and the social scientists?
So what are the barriers? Politics, money, engineers, or social scientists? There's a chap next to you. Will we pass along there?
Yeah, Freddie Pritchard-Smith from Trustec. Wanted to ask the question, with all these silos and different disciplines and the ever rise of AI, agentic AI, interactions between it, we have a public database of EPC data with building fabric materials, which can be queried. We have a national grid database of utility consumption, which can be queried and cross-referenced. Those two things can be done in less than 12 hours. Why is there not a priority list that is taken from that centralized database? And ultimately, what impact will AI have on these multidisciplinaries connecting together?
That's a really interesting one. What would the impact of AI be, given that we've got all that data out there? Chap in the middle then, and we'll go to the lady there, and Graham at the back. And the chap here, keep going, there we're going forward. Yeah, super.
Yeah, John Coggins, retired professor from the University of Glasgow. I'm an 80-year-old who's trying to improve his house, shall we say. But I have very little confidence in the kind of building people that I can employ to do that. I think we really have a lack of people in the building profession that can react to the changes that we will need to make. I saw a neighbour install roof panels, and the people installing the roof panels made holes in his roof, so it leaked. And I get frequent phone calls from the local authority say, would I like to have measurements made on my house about how much heat I'm losing? But it turns out that these are actually coming from builders who are not very competent, and they want to do awful things to my roof space, for example. So I think this is an issue that worries me. I don't think we have enough skills in
the skills
industry.
Question. Wonderful, the skills question. And we can bring that with AI. I've seen a brilliant one where you fly a drone around a house to do the survey. There was a lady in the black jacket there at the back, on this side here, on the right. And then as we're running out of time, Graham, I'm going to cut you out, I'm afraid. Just want to get back to the panel.
Thank you. Louise Shooter from Energy UK. So from all the panellists' presentations, the theme of community was really strong. And in terms of kind of policy delivery, aligning with that, it kind of seems like there's a really key role for local authorities. And while there's examples of really amazing schemes and best practice, what does the panel think local authorities need to kind of scale that across the country? So
Great. So what's the role of local authorities in scaling this, the local bit? So we've got barriers, AI, skills, and community and local authorities. Jennifer, what would you like to pick up on that?
I'll pick up on the community one and the skills one because I think they're linked. So I think local authorities potentially have a really key role to play because they understand their communities, we hope. And I think really what they need is some resource and then the kind of grant funding that was being deployed at a sort of national level under the previous administration, I think needs to be delegated to the local areas. Because that way you can tailor it to the needs of your local area and to the building stock type and to the people who live there and so on and the types of tenure and everything else. And what I saw, with my anecdote about the solar panels was that the guy that came to do our work, he knew what he was doing, but he'd then set up a company and he'd employed people and he'd sent them for training because he knew that there was this pipeline of work. And I think without the pipeline of work, we don't get people investing. And we've had examples before of, was it the housing energy performance certification thing that, lots of people train themselves up and then it got axed. So we need a certain amount of certainty. We need some aggregation of demand to enable local companies to invest in the skills locally. And that way you get those, the co-benefits of the jobs and the better homes and the kind of the reduction in friction for the householders in actually accessing this stuff. So that would be my view, is that you kind of have to bring those two issues together, really.
Community scale up. Chris?
I think in terms of trying to encourage confidence, which enables local authorities then, or anybody actually, to go forward with something which is a new field, you need demonstrators and you need prototypes and you need, apart from just having good ideas, you need people to actually see these things in action so that you can build enough confidence to say you're not going to get egg on your face if you go ahead and commit to it. And as an example, when I was on the Design Council, we ran a program called Design Bugs Out to dealing with MRSA in hospitals. And I think the Department of Health put about £1 million in to 10 little gangs of designer, health practitioner and manufacturer to come up with something which could tackle MRSA in hospitals. And one of the things that came out were tear-off strips on the curtains between beds to stop transmission from one to the next. A really, really simple idea. Another one was cupboards without backs on them, because you can't clean at the back of a cupboard. And there are things like that. When people saw them as real physical demonstrators, they went, oh, okay, all right, that's actually quite straightforward, and we could probably support that. It's not going to cost much money, and it looks as though it's going to have a fighting chance of working. So I think we've just done, through Innovate UK for Network Rail, a system of footbridges and lifts to improve the access for all across the railway system. To do hundreds of them, but we can't get commitment to do more than one at a time. So therefore, from the Department of Transport. So therefore, we're not getting funding to enable people to industrialize the process so you can actually get the advantage of the demonstrator. So you need a commitment to get off the sort of, I'm going to go to the people I met last week and going to go to them again type attitude, my friends. Yeah. Frameworks are particularly bad for this. And actually think about going to the people who are most capable of delivering.
So that's a demonstrate and industrialise.
Demonstrate, industrialise, and actually start to help secure the supply chain so that people will invest.
Mary, your take on those questions.
So I'll try and answer because I'm conscious of the time, with just one line. So in our centre, we are looking at specifically place-based approach to retrofitting and improving homes, and looking at, what does it mean for local authorities having sufficient resources for this, working closely with local communities. so that we can build local skills-based and have specifically those trusted installers. That one of the people in the audience said that there's little confidence in the building profession. So I think having that neighbourhood level based approach could help with all of this. And I hear that my colleague Donald is in the audience, so apologies that I can't join you for drinks later, but please go and find Donald and ask him more about that project. I'm sure he will be more than happy to share details.
Thank you. Helene.
Yeah, so two things I was just going to touch on. One around the communities piece. I think you mentioned the role of the local authority. The thing that I'm quite interested in at the moment is the role of industry in enabling communities. So we're involved with a charity called Footwork who support community innovators, and we're working with an organisation, a small, very, very small organisation in Grimsby called the West Marsh Development Trust, looking at how they can promote an ethical landlord. They want to acquire derelict properties in Grimsby, like 3 of them, and they want to retrofit them and then bring them into use as community landlords, and then proceeds will go back into the community centre, and the model is amazing if they can make it happen. And we're trying to help them with that as an industry mentor. But we've gone into that with the approach of how can we scale this support and how can we make it commercially sustainable as well for the wider sector to support community groups in a more joined up and sort of a better way than they are now. And I think that's a challenge that I would put to the wider industry, actually, is how can we... Somebody used a phrase at the Community Innovators get-together that we went to before Christmas, of how communities need the professionals on tap, not on top. So they need access in little bits and pieces when they need it. They've got the energy and they've got the motivation, and they're finding ways of funding things as well. But they need those little bits of steering on the way. And so I think as a sector, as an industry, we need to think more about how we can support that. And I don't think that's on the local authorities to do solely. And then the other point I was just going to make is that I would come across like some sort of data evangelist. I'm really not a data person. But the point about EPCs and UPRN consumer data, I would wholeheartedly support the principle of looking and using that data. But we have looked, and EPCs, there are challenges with EPCs. There are also challenges with the amount of information that is available is publicly available. So we need to unlock access to that information, I think, before we can do more with it. But once we can, there's huge potential, I agree.
Great. We've had a really incredible discussion. I think we could carry on for hours, actually. There's many aspects to pull out of this. But I really take home the message that this is a social and an engineering problem. I've kind of written down the phrase, we need to debox the house for the people and the planet. And I think that's the message I'm going to take home for the night. It's all about actually breaking down silos and working both at a local level all the way up to a national level, demystifying an area, not calling it retrofit, because this will have a real impact. It'll have an impact on people's lives in the sense they'll have cheaper energy bills, but have a real impact on lives because they'll have more healthy homes to live in as well. And we can use design, we can use our ingenuity in order to do that, but it is a significant size problem. Thank you to our wonderful panel, Jennifer Schooling, Helene Gosden, Chris Wise, Mary Martiskainen. I want also to thank the Royal Commission for the exhibition of 1851 for supporting this event. You all will be reminded to get an email survey following this event. We'd appreciate your feedback. And a recording of this event will appear on the Foundation's website tomorrow, where you'll see me mash everybody's names again as part of that. Our next event will be on the 29th of May in the University of Edinburgh, where we'll be discussing high-performance computing. And we're back here in the Royal Society on the 11th of June to discuss research collaboration with Africa. Details of both these events can be found on our website. Thank you for joining us, those of online. Thank you for the Slido questions as well. Thank you and goodbye. And for those of you in the room, there are drinks outside and dinner at 8. Thank you very much indeed.